All right, as we continue with Chapter 25, the United States in World War II, we're going to focus on Section 3 and Section 4 today. Looking at Section 3, the War in the Pacific. Now, while the Allies agreed that the defeat of the Nazis was their first priority, the United States didn't wait until Victory in Europe Day to move against Japan. Fortunately, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 had missed the Pacific's fleet submarines, and even more importantly, the attack had missed the fleet's aircraft carriers, which were out at sea at the time. In this section, we're going to try to focus and identify some of the key turning points in the war in the Pacific, to describe the Allied offensive that we had against the Japanese, look at both the development of the atomic bomb and debates about its use, and challenges faced by the Allies in building a just and lasting peace. Now, as we look at the Allies stemming the Japanese tide, we want to see how extensive the Japanese conquests were and how serious this really was. Really, in about the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had amassed an empire that dwarfed that of Hitler's Europe. On the Asian mainland, Japanese troops overran Hong Kong, French Indochina, Malaya, Burma, Thailand, and even much of China. They also swept south and east across the Pacific, conquering the Dutch East Indies, Guam, Wake Island, and the Solomon Islands, and many other outposts in the ocean. In the Philippines, which was kind of owned by the United States, you had about 80,000 American and Filipino troops battling the Japanese for control there. At the time of this invasion, the commander of the Allied forces there was a guy by the name of General Douglas MacArthur. When American and Filipino forces found themselves with their backs to the wall at a place called Bataan, President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to get out of there, to leave. And so on March 11th of 1942, MacArthur sneaks out at night and he pledges to the many thousands of men who didn't make it out, "I shall return." And unfortunately, the men that remain there, the Japanese are going to put them on what becomes known as the Bataan Death March. Many are going to die of starvation, lack of water, and dysentery. What American actions surprised the Japanese? Probably the biggest thing was the daring raid on Tokyo and other Japanese cities by put in charge of this task was a guy by the name of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, sometimes referred to as Doolittle's raid on Tokyo. He's going to lead 16 bombers in this attack. They weren't sure if they were going to make it, simply because they had to fly these planes further than what they really had the gas to use to get there. And most of them will get just past there and kind of crash land in China. But the air raid over Japan was seen as a success by the Americans and lifted Americans' sunken spirits after the attack of Pearl Harbor. The main Allied forces in the Pacific were mostly Americans and Australians. Everybody else was pretty much fighting Hitler. In May of 1942, the Americans and Australians working together will succeed in stopping the Japanese drive towards Australia in a very gruesome 5-day battle of the Coral Sea. Interesting about this battle is the fighting was done by airplanes that took off from these aircraft carriers, and not a single shot was fired by surface ships. And so for the first time since Pearl Harbor, a Japanese invasion had been stopped and turned back. What was important about the Battle of Midway? Well, Japan's next shot was toward Midway. Midway was a very strategic island that lay kind of northwest of Hawaii. Americans would help in the Battle of Midway is that Americans had broken the Japanese code and knew that Midway was to be their next target. In charge of this was a guy by the name of Admiral Chester Nimitz. He was the commander of the American naval forces in the Pacific, and he moves to defend that island, unleashing scout planes which will find the Japanese fleet, and torpedo planes that would and dive bombers that would attack them as well. The Japanese were just caught completely off guard here. Their planes still on the decks of their carriers, not even had taken off yet. This was a huge success for the American fleet. In the words of a Japanese official, at Midway, he believed that Americans had avenged Pearl Harbor. So this becomes a real turning point in the Pacific War as the United States soon begins what's called island hopping. Island by island, they'll win territory back from the Japanese, and with each island, Allied forces move closer to their targets in Japan. So they take less fortified islands, skip the others. The first Allied offensive, when you talk about the Allies go on the offensive, the first Allied offensive really begins in August of 1942, when American troops storm what's called Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. By the time the Japanese abandoned Guadalcanal 6 months later, most people called it the Island of Death. But Guadalcanal marked Japan's first defeat on land. The Japanese then started to test a new tactic called the kamikaze, or suicide plane, an attack in which Japanese pilots would crash their bomb-laden planes into Allied ships. Americans watched these terrifying attacks with kind of a strange mixture of respect and pity. But it was amazing horror to see this actually happen. And really kind of an interesting photo on the upper right. You see one of these planes about to hit an American fighter. And I didn't show you the picture that was taken after this, but it was quite an explosion. Why did the Japanese fight so hard on Iwo Jima? Well, MacArthur and the Allies turned to Iwo Jima because it was extremely critical to the United States as a base from which heavily loaded bombers might reach Japan. It was also perhaps, and some believe, the most heavily defended spot on Earth, with over almost 21,000 Japanese troops entrenched in tunnels and caves. Just one obstacle, once we defeated the Japanese here, only one obstacle really stood between the Allies and a final assault on Japan, and that was really the island of Okinawa. The picture on the bottom right, that's Iwo Jima. And there's going to be some very gruesome fighting on Iwo Jima. And these soldiers, you can see they're kind of looking straight ahead, and that's Mount Suribuchi. That, of course, is where you get the picture of those guys putting the flag up. That's what they were going after. This was an island that just had an airfield on it, and the Japanese knew that if the Americans got this, it would allow them to load up heavy bombers, planes, and attack Japan. So why did the Allies believe Okinawa, though, was a foretaste of an invasion of Japan? Now, in April of '45, the U.S. Marines finally do invade Okinawa. Once on shore, the Allies faced even fiercer opposition than on Iwo Jima. By the time the fighting ended, from April now into June of 45, more than 7,600 Americans had died. But the Japanese paid an even ghastlier price, about 110,000 lives just in defending Okinawa. And when we talk about why it was a foretaste, well, the battle, most Allied commanders believed that, imagined that an invasion of Japan, their actual homeland, if this was how bad the Japanese protected Okinawa, it would be even worse if we attacked Japan. The taking of Iwo Jima and Okinawa opened the way for an invasion of Japan. And so we're going to look at and talk about now the atomic bomb that really brings the war to an end, focusing on, of course, the Manhattan Project. However, Allied leaders knew that such an invasion, of course, would become a very desperate struggle. Japan still had a huge army. President Truman saw only one way to avoid an invasion of Japan, and he decided to use a powerful new weapon that had been developed by scientists working with the military on what was called the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. This Manhattan Project was led by a private sector and a military sector. On the military side, it was led by General Leslie Groves, and on the private sector, it was research directed by American scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer. The development of the atomic bomb was not only the most ambitious scientific enterprise in history, it was also probably the best kept secret of the war. Now, some agree that, like Truman, that this was a military weapon and should be used, especially if it can end the war, especially with the anticipated number of deaths, American and Japanese, that would be inflicted with an attack on Japan mainland. And of course, some felt it would just be simply immoral to drop it because of its destruction. So when was it used? Finally, in August of 1945, the 6th and the 9th, the B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay. That airplane still exists. It's in an airport hangar / museum at Dulles Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. They dropped, and interestingly, they named these guys. And the one that you see on the bottom right there is Little Boy. And Little Boy will drop on Hiroshima, and 3 days later, Fat Man will drop on Nagasaki. Japan was warned of each of these, the droppings of each of these bombs, and warned that if they didn't surrender, they would face prompt and utter destruction. But unfortunately, Japan had refused. All right, so the last part of Section 3, rebuilding begins. With Japan's surrender, the Allies turned to the challenge of rebuilding war-torn nations. Even before the last guns fell silent, they began thinking about principles that would govern the post-war world. And keep in mind, we just last slide talked about Truman making the decision to drop the atomic bomb. What happens here, remember, is February of 45. You look at the picture on the upper right there. You got Roosevelt. He's still alive here. He doesn't die until April. And so he's going to meet in the Soviet Union at a place called Yalta, known as the Yalta Conference, with what they refer to as the Big Three. You've got, in that picture, you look going from left to right, you've got Winston Churchill, FDR, of course, and then Stalin. For 8 days, the three leaders discussed the fate of Germany and the post-war world. Stalin obviously was hoping for a harsh approach against Germany. Churchill strongly disagreed, and causing a dying Franklin Roosevelt to act as mediator. Roosevelt almost kind of sided a little bit more with Stalin here than Churchill. for a couple of reasons. One, he hoped that the Soviet Union would stand by its commitment to join in the war against Japan, yet that was still going on. And secondly, he wanted Stalin's support for a new peacekeeping organization, which would become known as the United Nations, the UN. After all of that, after the war, what did the United States do with the surviving leaders of Germany and Japan? Well, as with most wars, they're going to put these guys on trial. And these Nazi leaders are put on trial in a city in Germany called Nuremberg, and they become known as the Nuremberg trials. And they're put on trial for crimes against humanity, peace and war crimes. 12 of the 24 would be sentenced to death. Some would actually commit suicide before that. And I think the important thing about these Nuremberg trials is they establish the idea that individuals are responsible for their actions here, even in times of war. You can't hide behind a thing, well, it's war, anything can happen. That was changing. And the Nuremberg trials really emphasize that change. On the Japanese side, 7 Japanese, including Tojo, were going to be executed, and thousands would be imprisoned for the way they treated American soldiers and for other war crimes. What happens to Japan after the war? Well, it'll be occupied by the United States, and kind of as the acting, you might say, governor, military governor, is General MacArthur, whose picture is on the bottom right there. MacArthur would basically force the Japanese to change their economic and political thinking. He will introduce free market practices and writes for them a new constitution that's literally known as the MacArthur Constitution to this day. Provided for women's suffrage and many other freedoms that most Japanese never got a chance to really share. All right, section 4, the last section here. As we look at the home front back in the United States, in contrast to the Great Depression, World War II was a time of opportunity for millions of Americans. Jobs abounded, and despite rationing and shortages, people had money to spend. And at the end of World War II, the nation emerged as the world's dominant economic and military power. And so in this section, we're going to kind of look at that economic and social change that reshaped American life, and then summarize some of the opportunity and discrimination against minorities, especially African Americans. So as defense industries boomed, unemployment literally fell to a low of about 1.2% in 1944. Even with price and wage controls, average weekly paychecks still rose about 35% during the war. And even though workers were still protesting some of the long hours and the overtime and having to work night shifts, they were actually able to save money during this time, especially for the future. Farmers also prospered during the war. They benefited from improvements in farm machinery as well as fertilizers, and they reaped the profits from rising crop prices due to the fact that the world was in a war, and our farm fields were not affected by that war. So as a result, crop production increased by some 50%. That's amazing. And farm income triples. And literally before the war ends, many farmers actually are able to pay off their mortgages. What a huge benefit for farmers there. Women also enjoy employment gains during the war. Over 6 million women entered the workforce for the first time, boosting the percentage of women in total workforce up to 35%. A third of those jobs were in defense plants, which offered women more challenging work but better pay than jobs that were traditionally associated with women. With men away at war, many women also took advantage of openings in other professions, including like journalism. How did the growth of the defense industry affect American population patterns? This also becomes kind of interesting. So in addition to revamping the economy, the war also triggered one of the greatest mass migrations in American history. Americans whose families had lived for decades, sometimes even longer in one place, suddenly uprooted themselves to seek work somewhere else. More than 1 million newcomers are going to pour into California alone between 1941 in 1944. So how did wartime activities affect the family? Well, this is kind of crucial too. Families adjusted to the changes brought on by the war as best they could. With millions of fathers in the armed forces, mothers struggled to rear their children all by themselves. Many young children got used to being left with neighbors or relatives or in child care centers, as more and more mothers ended up going to work. Teenagers left at home without parents sometimes drifted into juvenile delinquency. And then when fathers finally did come home, there was also that painful period of readjustment as family members had to try and get to know each other again. In 1944, to kind of help ease this transition of returning servicemen to civilian life, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known as the GI Bill. The bill provided education and training for veterans, paid for by the federal government. It also provided federal loan guarantees to veterans buying homes or farms, or even just starting a new business. One of the things about this GI Bill that is of importance here is that the government all of a sudden saw millions of men returning to the workforce and feared that we would fall right back into unemployment again and a Great Depression. And this was their way of kind of easing all of these men back into the workforce. And it was actually quite successful. But discrimination, despite the opportunities that opened for women and minorities during the war, old prejudices and policies persisted both in the military and at home. And so we're going to look at discrimination, reaction, as well as to the internment of many Japanese Americans. And so the first question is, how were African Americans treated at home and in the military? Now, African Americans actually made quite a bit of progress on the home front. During the war, thousands of African Americans are going to leave the South, the majority of them moving to the Midwest, where better jobs were found. Between 1940 and 44, the percentage of African Americans working in skilled and semi-skilled jobs rose from 16% to 30%. So excellent progress there. But wherever African Americans moved, there's always a little bit of friction. And discrimination presented some tough hurdles for blacks moving in the North. In 1942, you had civil rights leader James Farmer. He will found the interracial organization called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE for short, to confront urban segregation in the North. And CORE would remain through those 50s and 60s and being very instrumental in civil rights movement during that time. As black migrants moved into already overcrowded cities, again, those tensions rose. And in 1943, it kind of hit a peak. A tidal wave of racial violence really swept across the country. The worst conflict erupted in Detroit. The fighting raged on for 3 days. By the time Roosevelt sent federal troops to restore order, 9 whites and 25 blacks lay dead or dying. The violence of 1943 really revealed to many Americans, black and white alike, how serious racial tensions had become in the United States. And that was just the beginning. Progress was slow, but for African Americans and many whites, they were determined not to give up on many of the gains that they had made. Japanese Americans probably suffered one of the biggest probably injustices early on. Many of these Japanese, because Japan actually bombs Pearl Harbor and brings us into the war, fear and rumors just abound rapidly, especially on the West Coast in California primarily, who has a history of issues with Chinese and Japanese and even Filipinos. And they are going to press Congress and the War Department to call for a mass evacuation for fear that these Japanese Americans are going to side with Japan and probably sabotage the West Coast. And so these rumors just created this fear, and we can kind of see that same type of fear right now with coronavirus. Should we wear masks? Should we not wear masks? Should we be 6 feet or should we be 12 feet from each other? Should we shut down the economy or should we keep it going? We got all these rumors going around too, and that was strong in this case as well. In 1942, the War Department called for a mass evacuation of all Japanese Americans, and they would be placed in these internment camps. Eventually, how were they compensated for this? Well, in 1944, the Supreme Court actually rules that the government was justified in Korematsu versus the United States. Justified on the basis of military necessity. In 1965, Congress kind of backs away from that and authorizes $38 million to compensate these Japanese Americans for their losses. Nothing's really done at that point. And finally, in 1988, Congress will pass a bill, and Reagan will sign it to pay $20,000 to every Japanese American that was sent to an internment camp. Again, a huge injustice for these Americans at the beginning of World War II.